December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The sky was the color of steel. Snow drifted down like ash, quieting the sound of everything except the distant thud of artillery. In the frozen trenches near St. Vith, a group of exhausted American soldiers crouched behind a splintered pine tree line, their breath turning to vapor in the cold. Among them was Staff Sergeant William Carter, 28 years old, son of a railway worker from Georgia. They called him Doc, not because he was a medic, but because he spoke languages: French, a little Italian, and, to the astonishment of his unit, fluent German. He'd learned it long before the war, in night classes at a segregated college in Chicago. He'd believed languages could open doors. He never imagined one day those doors would lead him straight into the heart of a German prison camp. The Battle of the Bulge had exploded only 2 days earlier. Hitler's desperate gamble to break through Allied lines. The snow-concealed tanks, muffled boots, swallowed orders. Amid the chaos, Carter's unit was cut off and surrounded by panzer troops near a small Belgian village. That morning, they'd fought until their ammo was gone. By afternoon, the woods were silent, except for the clicking of German rifles. Carter raised his hands. The others followed. They were captured. When the Germans marched them down the narrow road, Carter noticed how the guards kept glancing at him, their faces twisting between confusion and contempt. In their eyes, a black American soldier in uniform was something of a contradiction, a product of a country that preached freedom but segregated its own army. That night, they reached a temporary holding site. An old farmhouse turned into a makeshift POW collection point. Straw on the floor. No windows. A single kerosene lamp swinging from the rafters. The guards barked orders, laughing as they divided prisoners into groups. Officers, enlisted, wounded. Then one guard, a tall man with icy eyes, stepped closer to Carter. He squinted, sneered, and muttered in German, "Schau dir das an." Ein Neger in Amerikanischer uniform. Look at that! A Negro in an American uniform. Another guard chuckled. They didn't know Carter understood every word. He said nothing, just kept his gaze level, his jaw locked. For the next few minutes, they mocked him openly, assuming he was deaf to their language. They called him an animal, a circus act, something the Americans must be desperate to use. Then one of them turned to him, sneering in English, "You, black man, you fight for America? They let you carry gun?" And that's when Carter spoke, calmly, clearly, in flawless German. "Ich kämpfe für mein Land, so wie Sie für Ihres. I fight for my country, just as you fight for yours." The room fell silent. Every German head turned. The lamp flickered. The laughter died. For a long moment, no one moved. The tall guard's face froze, then flushed red. He barked something to his comrades, but his voice cracked. That single moment, a black American POW, answering back in perfect German, would travel through the camp like wildfire. It challenged everything the guards had been taught to believe about race, power, and intelligence. And it would change how Carter was treated, for better and worse, in the months to come. This is the story of what happened when black POWs spoke fluent German to their captors and shattered the myth of racial superiority inside Hitler's own war machine. In 1944, the U.S. Army was still segregated. Black soldiers fought in separate units, often given the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs: supply lines, ammunition carriers, engineers, truck drivers. Few were allowed direct combat roles, yet on the European front, the demand for manpower was so great that even Washington's prejudice began to crack. Thousands of black soldiers found themselves in the line of fire, from Normandy to the Alps. They called it Double V, victory abroad against fascism, and victory at home against racism. The irony was brutal. They were asked to fight for freedom in Europe, while being denied it in their own barracks. They marched past white-only signs in uniform. Some officers refused to salute black lieutenants. Medals were delayed, promotions denied, stories erased. But they fought anyway. And when captured, they entered an entirely new layer of contradiction. A segregated army, inside an enemy prison system built on racial ideology. In the first weeks of the Battle of the Bulge, over 20,000 Allied soldiers were captured by the Germans. Among them, roughly 2,000 were African Americans. Most were members of service units, truck convoys, artillery support, supply companies, caught in surprise ambushes during the German counteroffensive. When the Nazis realized they had black prisoners, confusion set in. Official Nazi ideology classified black people as Untermenschen, subhuman, not deserving of the same treatment as white POWs under the Geneva Convention. But the Wehrmacht needed propaganda value and feared retaliation if they murdered Allied soldiers indiscriminately. So, treatment varied. Some black POWs were sent to the same stalags, POW camps, as white Americans, but isolated in separate barracks. Others were transferred to labor camps, forced to clear rubble or dig graves under harsh winter conditions. And there were rumors, whispers, that the SS occasionally removed certain prisoners from the lists altogether. Still, in the chaos of retreat and capture, pockets of humanity surfaced. Some German soldiers, especially older or war-weary ones, treated all captives alike. Others viewed black POWs with morbid curiosity, as if they were walking contradictions. Into this uncertain world, Staff Sergeant Carter was delivered. By early January 1945, Carter and his group were transported east to Stalag 9B near Bad Orb, one of the largest and most notorious German POW camps. The journey took days. They were crammed into cattle cars, 40 men to a wagon. No heat, no food, no latrines. The temperature dipped below freezing. When the doors finally opened, they were half-conscious, reeking of sweat and frostbite. The guards herded them through the gates under a wooden sign marked Kriegsgefangenenlager 9B. Behind the barbed wire, thousands of Allied prisoners milled about. British, French, Americans, even Russians. Thin, hollow-eyed men in tattered uniforms. But among them, the few black POWs immediately drew attention. Some German guards stared with open hostility. Others smirked in disbelief. Carter overheard one officer whisper, "Die Amerikaner schicken sogar Neger in den Krieg." The Americans even send Negroes to war. Carter's jaw clenched. He answered quietly, "Und wir sind immer noch hier." And yet we're still here. The officer's head snapped toward him. Another shock, another wound to ideology. Inside Stalag 9B, survival depended on adaptation. Prisoners learned who to trade with, how to stretch a loaf of bread for a week, how to keep lice at bay. The Red Cross parcels became lifelines. Canned meat, biscuits, cigarettes, chocolate. Carter quickly realized that language was power. He could understand the guards' conversations, their schedules, their moods, their orders. Sometimes it saved lives. He'd overhear an announcement about food distribution or punishment and quietly warn others. But it was dangerous, too. If the guards learned he understood German, they might see him as a threat, a spy, or worse, a challenge to the racial hierarchy that held their world together. Still, word spread among prisoners. There's a guy who understands the Krauts. One night, as snow fell thick outside the barracks, Carter heard the German guards discussing an incoming transport. Wounded men from the front, including captured black French colonial troops. He whispered to his bunkmate, "They're bringing in Senegalese soldiers tomorrow." They'll need blankets. His bunkmate frowned. How the hell you know that? Carter only smiled. Let's just say I listen better than most. Even inside captivity, segregation persisted. The Americans organized their own lines of separation, partly out of habit, partly to avoid trouble with guards. Some white American officers refused to share rations or bunks with black soldiers. Others quietly admired their endurance. The Germans exploited that tension. They would feed one group first, punish the other for imagined offenses, spread rumors to divide morale. Carter often stood between worlds, neither trusted by guards nor fully accepted by his fellow POWs. But when the Germans discovered his fluency in their tongue, everything changed. It began with a simple misunderstanding. A young guard, barely 18, had dropped his rifle during inspection. His superior berated him in German, calling him idiot and coward. The words echoed across the courtyard. Without thinking, Carter muttered under his breath, "Lass ihn in Ruhe. Er weiß es nicht besser. Leave him alone. He doesn't know better." The officer spun around, eyes wide. "Wer hat das gesagt? Who said that?" Carter didn't move. The officer scanned the line until his gaze locked on the only black face in the group. "You speak German?" Carter hesitated, then nodded. The officer stepped closer, incredulous. "Where did you learn?" "Chicago," Carter replied evenly. "From a teacher who said understanding your enemy was a form of respect." The officer's jaw tightened. He didn't respond. He just stared, as though trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he'd been taught. From that day, things shifted. Some guards avoided Carter entirely. Others watched him with a mix of fear and fascination. A few even began to ask him quiet questions when their superiors weren't looking. About America, about jazz, about what it felt like to live in a country where colored soldiers fought alongside whites. For Nazi Germany, Carter's very existence was a paradox. He wore the uniform of a powerful enemy, carried himself with discipline, and now spoke their own language fluently. It contradicted the racial pseudoscience drilled into them since childhood. The Schwarze Schande, black shame, was propaganda used to dehumanize Africans and African Americans. Yet here stood a man who broke every stereotype. Some guards grew hostile, muttering slurs louder, asserting dominance through brutality. Others grew quieter, unsettled. Carter's German was not perfect, but it was elegant, formal, educated. And education, to them, was supposed to be proof of Aryan superiority. Now it was proof of something else, that intelligence, discipline, and dignity transcended the color line. The next morning began in silence. The kind of silence only war can create, when both sides have fired enough bullets to run out of sound itself. Frost clung to the barbed wire. The men stirred slowly, each one carrying a private ache that had no name. Private William Hollis sat by the fence, rubbing his hands together for warmth. His skin cracked with the cold, and the air carried a faint tang of diesel smoke. In the distance, he could hear the boots of the guards on gravel. That's when he heard it. A laugh. Not English, not French, but German. The guards were joking about them. The Schwarze Soldaten, the black soldiers. Their tone was mocking, sharp, dismissive. Hollis didn't need to understand every word. He'd heard that tone before. Back home, it had come from white men who looked at him as if he didn't belong in his own uniform. But here, behind enemy lines, it carried a different weight, one that could mean life or death. He turned to Private First Class Henry Owens, the youngest of their group, a 21-year-old from Chicago who used to repair radios before the war. Owens had studied German for 2 years before enlisting. thinking it might help him understand the enemy better. "Henry," Hollis whispered, "you still remember any of that German you studied?" Owens nodded cautiously. "A bit. Enough to catch what they're saying." "What are they saying now?" Owens hesitated. "They're saying we're not supposed to be here, that the Americans must be desperate to send people like us." The men looked down. No one spoke, but inside each of them, something burned. Quiet, fierce, and steady. Hours passed before a new group of guards arrived. They were different, younger, less hardened. One of them, a tall blond man with a scar running from his jaw to his ear, seemed curious. He looked at the prisoners as though trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, he muttered to another guard, "Wie können Sie Amerikaner sein? Sie sehen aus wie Afrikaner." "How can they be Americans? They look like Africans." This time, Owens responded, softly but clearly. "Wir sind Amerikaner. Geboren in Chicago. Gekämpft für Freiheit. Genau wie Sie behaupten." "We are Americans, born in Chicago. We fought for freedom, just like you claim to." The words hit the air like a rifle shot. The guard froze. His hand tightened on his weapon. The other soldiers turned sharply. For a second, no one moved. Then came a murmur. Disbelief? Then curiosity. "Er spricht Deutsch," one of them exclaimed. "He speaks German." Owens stood tall, his breath forming a pale mist in the air. "Ja, und wir verstehen auch, was ihr über uns sagt." "Yes, and we also understand what you're saying about us." The tension broke into a stunned silence. The guards didn't know how to react. These men, whom they'd mocked as inferior, were now speaking their own language with fluency. The power dynamic shifted, subtly but unmistakably. One of the older guards barked something to his men and walked away, his boots crunching over snow. The others avoided eye contact. Later that day, Owens was summoned to the command hut. Inside, a senior German officer sat at a wooden desk, maps spread before him. His uniform was crisp, his demeanor precise, a man accustomed to order. He looked up slowly. "Private Owens," he said in measured English. "You speak German?" "Yes, sir." The officer nodded thoughtfully. "Where did you learn it?" "From books," Owens replied. "In school." "My father wanted me to study languages." The officer studied him carefully. "Interesting. Most of your countrymen, how shall we say, are not given such education." Owens met his gaze without blinking. "Most of my countrymen aren't given much of anything. But we take what we can, sir." For a long time, neither spoke. Then the officer gestured for him to sit. "Tell me, Private," he said quietly, "what does America promise men like you?" Owens hesitated, then answered, "It promises freedom, but it doesn't always deliver it." The officer leaned back, as though testing the truth of that statement. Outside, the wind howled through the barracks. "You see," the German continued, "our propaganda says that your country treats you worse than we ever would. That you are fighting for a nation that despises you? Is that not true?" Owens's jaw tightened. "Maybe some of it is true. But that's not why I fight. I fight because it's my home. And because even if America doesn't see us as equal yet, someday it will. And I want to be part of that fight." The officer's expression softened, not out of sympathy, but curiosity. "You are an unusual man, Private Owens." "Just an American, sir," he said quietly. "Same as any other." That evening, the guards' behavior began to change. The laughter faded. The jeers stopped. When they spoke among themselves, it was no longer mockery. It was confusion. Some even brought small favors, an extra slice of bread, a cigarette. It wasn't kindness. It was respect. born of surprise. For the first time, the German soldiers had glimpsed something they couldn't reconcile. A man they'd been taught to see as inferior, speaking their language with the confidence of an equal. Word spread across the camp. "The black American who speaks German," they called him, and for the men around him, it changed everything. Hollis whispered one night, "They're starting to look at us different." Owens nodded, "Because now they see us. Not as what they were told, but as who we are." As the weeks passed, more of the black POWs picked up German phrases. They started greeting the guards in their own tongue, small acts of quiet defiance. It didn't win them freedom, but it gave them dignity. And dignity, in a place built to erase it, was its own kind of rebellion. When respect becomes dangerous in the wrong man's eyes. Winter pressed on without mercy. Snow blanketed everything, the guard towers, the fences, even the forgotten helmets half buried near the barracks. The world outside was still fighting, but inside this German POW camp, another kind of battle had begun. One that lived in silence, language, and pride. For Private Henry Owens, the days felt heavier now. Ever since he spoke German to the guards, he had become something else in their eyes. Not merely a prisoner, but a curiosity. Some guards treated him with cautious interest, others with suspicion. And at the top of that watchful list stood Commandant Dieter Kruger. Kruger was a veteran of the Eastern Front, cold, disciplined, intelligent. He believed in order above ideology, but he had been raised under the iron shadow of Nazi propaganda. Men like Owens didn't fit that order, and so he decided to test him. It started one morning in February. A guard entered the barracks with a sharp command. "Owens, mitkommen. Owens, come with me." Owens stood, straightened his posture, and followed. Hollis caught his sleeve as he passed. "You sure you want to go?" Owens nodded. "Doesn't matter if I want to." "I have to." They walked across the frozen yard to the commandant's office. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of tobacco and damp wool. Kruger sat behind a wooden desk, a ledger open before him. "Sit," he said in clipped English. Owens sat. His eyes moved briefly across the room. Bookshelves lined with military reports, a globe marked with pins, a faded photograph of Kruger's family. "I've been reading about your army," Kruger began, "about the Tuskegee Airmen and the Buffalo Soldiers. I am told your people fight bravely, even when your own officers do not respect you. Is that true?" Owens paused before answering. "Some do. Some don't. We fight, because the job still needs to be done." Kruger nodded slowly, then leaned forward. "You speak our language well. You read and write it too?" "Yes, sir." Kruger pushed a paper across the desk. "Then translate this." It was a military communique, short, coded, routine. Owens read carefully, pen scratching quietly as he worked. When he finished, Kruger examined the translation. His eyes flickered with something unreadable, approval mixed with unease. "Very good," he said. "Better than some of my own men." Then, after a pause, "Tell me, Private, if I offered you better food, warmer clothes, perhaps a position as interpreter, would you take it?" Owens's hand froze. He knew the risk. To accept would make him a collaborator in the eyes of his fellow prisoners. To refuse might mean punishment. He looked Kruger in the eye. "I didn't come here to serve you, sir. I came here because I got caught serving my country." Kruger's face tightened, but he said nothing. He closed the folder, leaned back, and studied him like a riddle he couldn't solve. "You could have been more than a soldier, Owens," he said finally. "In another world, perhaps a teacher. Or a scholar." Owens answered quietly, "Maybe Someday, I still will be. That evening, the guards escorted him back to the barracks. The men gathered around as he entered. "What happened?" Hollis asked. "He wanted me to translate," Owens replied. "Wanted to see if I'd bend." "And?" Owens looked around at his fellow prisoners, tired, shivering men who had nothing left but their pride. "I didn't bend." They said nothing for a while, but something passed between them. Not words, but understanding. Over the next few weeks, small changes spread through the camp. The guards grew quieter when passing the black soldiers. A few began exchanging polite greetings. One even smuggled an old newspaper into the barracks, Die Wacht am Rhein, its pages yellowed and torn. Owens would read aloud in German, then translate. The men listened, half to the words, half to the sound of defiance in his voice. They didn't realize that the commandant was listening too. One night, Kruger summoned Owens again. This time, his tone was different, not stern, but strangely reflective. "Do you know what happens to German soldiers if they show sympathy toward prisoners?" he asked. Owens shook his head. "They are sent east," Kruger said, "where men don't come back." He paused. "I should report your defiance. But instead, I will ask you one question." Owens waited. "When this war ends, if it ever does, do you believe your America will change for men like you?" Owens didn't answer right away. He thought about the things he'd seen, the separate barracks, the unequal pay, the way white officers avoided eating beside them even on the same front. Finally, he said, "I believe it has to. Otherwise, everything we've done here means nothing." Kruger stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the snow. "Perhaps that is what makes you dangerous," he murmured. "You believe in something even when it does not believe in you." Owens didn't respond. A moment later, the commandant dismissed him with a single word. "Go." Back in the barracks, Owens told no one what had been said. But something inside him had changed. He began to see his captivity not as defeat, but as a stage on which dignity could still live. He started teaching German phrases to the other POWs, not to mock the guards, but to understand them. Soon, the men were trading jokes, asking for supplies, and even negotiating rations in broken German. It was subtle, quiet resistance, but it was powerful. For the first time, they could speak back, and the guards, caught between doctrine and doubt, began to see their prisoners as something more than propaganda could explain. But peace never lasts long in war. Word of Owens's defiance reached Berlin through intercepted reports. Orders came down. Reassign or silence any prisoner displaying subversive influence. One icy morning, a black car rolled through the camp gates. 2 Gestapo officers stepped out. The men inside the barracks watched from their bunks, their breath heavy with fear. The commandant's test had ended. Now, the real danger was about to begin. When language becomes a weapon, and silence an act of war. The black car idled at the edge of the snow-covered yard, its exhaust clouding into the cold air. 2 men stepped out. Long leather coats, steel gray caps, faces carved from the same stone as the Reich itself. The prisoners didn't need introductions. Everyone knew who they were. Gestapo. Commandant Kruger met them outside his office, hat tucked under his arm. Their conversation was quiet, clipped, but the tension radiated outward like static. Within minutes, the order was given. "Bring Owens." The guards entered the barracks. "Henry Owens!" one barked. Every man turned. Owens rose slowly, his breath steady. Hollis reached for his sleeve. "Don't say a word, Henry." Not one word. Owens nodded and followed. The walk felt longer than usual, the crunch of snow under his boots louder than the rest of the world. Inside, the Gestapo officers waited in Kruger's office. One of them, taller, with deep lines around his mouth, motioned to a chair. "Sit." Owens sat. The man flipped open a folder. Private Henry Owens, captured near Hürtgen Forest. You speak German fluently. How? Owens met his gaze. I studied before the war. Studied where? Chicago. I had a teacher from Hamburg. The second officer, younger, impatient, leaned forward. Why learn German? To spy? Owens shook his head. To understand. They laughed, cold, humorless. You think you understand us? The tall one said. You think because you can speak our words, you know our minds? Owens didn't flinch. I think words show more truth than uniforms. The younger one slammed his hand on the desk. Answer only what you are asked. Kruger, standing off to the side, said nothing. His jaw was tight. He had brought Owens into this room once before. But now he could do nothing to protect him. The interrogation dragged on for hours. They questioned Owens about Allied plans, about the 92nd Infantry Division, about the Negertruppen, the Nazi term for black soldiers that dripped with contempt. Owens answered only what he had to. The rest he met with silence. When they realized intimidation wasn't working, they shifted tactics. You are not like the others, the tall one said. You could be useful. You could translate for us. Your conditions would improve. Owens's response was calm, steady, final. I'm already a prisoner. I don't need to be your voice, too. A long silence filled the room. Then the younger Gestapo officer stood, grabbed Owens by the collar and hissed, You will regret your arrogance. Kruger finally spoke. That's enough. The officer glared at him. You are too soft, Commandant. This man insults the Reich in your own office. Kruger's eyes flicked toward Owens, just for a second, and then back. This man is a prisoner of war, under the Geneva Convention. The room froze. The word convention hung heavy. A fragile line of law in a world where laws meant little. The Gestapo man sneered. The Geneva Convention was not written for men like him. Owens looked directly at him. Then maybe that's why I'm here. To remind you it should have been. The younger officer lunged, but Kruger stepped forward, blocking his path. Take him back to his barracks. I will file my report. The Gestapo hesitated. Finally, the taller one gave a curt nod. This conversation is not finished. When they left, the commandant turned to Owens. His voice was low, almost weary. You should not have said that. Owens replied, Maybe not. But someone had to. Kruger stared at him for a moment, then said quietly, You are either the bravest man I have met, or the most foolish. Owens answered, Maybe both. That night, a storm rolled across northern Germany. The wind howled through the camp fences. Inside the barracks, the men huddled close, waiting. Owens sat on his bunk, eyes fixed on the ceiling. He could still feel the weight of the Gestapo's gaze. He knew he was being watched, that at any moment the car could return. But strangely, he wasn't afraid. Hollis whispered from the other bunk, You okay, Henry? Yeah, Owens said softly. I just realized something. What's that? They think power is in the gun. But it's really in the word days passed. The Gestapo didn't return. Rumor spread that the front was collapsing, that Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. The guards grew restless. Some whispered that Berlin was burning. By late April, the sound of artillery echoed faintly from the west. One morning, when the prisoners lined up for roll call, the towers were empty. The gates stood ajar. The war, for them, was over. Owens and his men walked out, through the snowmelt and silence, past the barracks, past the wire, past the place where their names had been reduced to numbers. They found an abandoned German truck and a tattered map. Following the sun, they made their way west until they met an American patrol. White soldiers in olive drab helmets, rifles ready. The sergeant stared at them in disbelief. "You boys been out here all this time?" Owens nodded. "Yes, sir." The sergeant squinted. "You're lucky the Krauts didn't shoot you." Owens almost smiled. Some tried. Some listened. When he returned home months later, the victory parades were already over. The papers spoke of heroes, of liberation, of freedom restored. But not a word about the men who had fought two wars, one against the enemy and one against disbelief. For years, Owens never told the full story. Not about the commandant who protected him from the Gestapo, nor the night he refused to translate for those who despised him. But decades later, when journalists and historians began documenting the forgotten soldiers of World War II, the black POWs who spoke fluent German, the men who defied stereotypes, Owens's name surfaced again. His letters were found, his words translated, his dignity preserved. One of his notes read simply, "In that camp, I learned the truth about language. You can use it to command. You can use it to deceive. But you can also use it to prove you belong to the same world as your enemy." The story of Henry Owens and hundreds like him reveals a side of history long hidden in the shadows. The courage of black soldiers who not only fought for a nation that didn't see them as equals, but also faced their captors with intelligence and humanity that broke through hate. They didn't win medals or monuments, but they won something deeper: recognition of their worth in the most unlikely place, the heart of their enemy. When the U.S. military was finally desegregated in 1948, it wasn't just policy that changed, it was the quiet proof left behind by men like Owens. Proof that courage, intellect, and dignity have no color. Their legacy endures not in statues, but in stories like this one. They were captured soldiers, nameless in the snow. But when they spoke in fluent German, something cracked in the walls of prejudice. The guards saw men, not myths, not propaganda, but men. And sometimes that is how empires fall, not through fire, but through understanding. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, subscribe to the channel, share this story, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because these are the voices history tried to forget, and together we can make sure they're never silenced again.